muutama sana. Ensinnäkin tervetuloa tänne meidän seminaariin, jota me ollaan itse odotettu koko syksy ja toivottavasti kaikki muutkin. Kulttuurivoimala on perustettu vuonna 2000 Kemissä alun perin. Ja siellä on se kulttuurivoimala rakennus. Ja erilaista syystä johtuen, niin 2009 me siirryimme Ouluun. Ja täällä on siilorakennus. Eli kulttuurivoimala on aina sidoksissa näköjään johonkin rakennukseen. Nyt meillä on täällä siilo, jota me olemme kunnostamassa vähin elin. Ja kulttuurivoimalan perusajatus kiteytyy oikeastaan yhteen lauseeseen. Se on, itse kutsumme itseämme yhteisö-, ympäristö- ja mediataiteen keskuksiksi. Ja tällaisia keskuksia minun tietääkseni Suomessa ei ole olemassa tällä hetkellä.
So I'll tell you a little bit about leader action groups in general in Finland, and then the leader groups in Northern Asukastupa and a little specific about kohdassa leader. And we have a phrase, leader ihmisten kokoisille ideaille. That means leader is for human scale ideas. It's actions.
Celia is a writer. I'm an artist. We have been working together for about 28 years. We're based near Manchester in the northwest of England. And our work really looked at the role of art and social and environmental change. Okay. We chose the name for our organization, Littoral. And I don't know what the Finnish translation is, but it's the space between high tide and low tide on the beach, which is a turbulent zone, a changing zone, but also the space between the sea and the land, the littoral. But it's also to say that we're interested in, if you like, the space between the art world, the cultural world, and what's called the life world, the social world. So there is not maybe a gap, but there's it's that space in between that we like to work in. And what we discovered, and the presentation will really focus on, is how, in a sense, the rural and agriculture, we discovered, well, it wasn't our discovery, became clear, was a zone which was really absent in terms of cultural policy in England, arts and cultural policy, because it was mainly focused on the urban. Of course, we have rural community arts, because there's a big tradition of community arts in rural England, and also particularly through Leader, but this is not really what we're going to talk about this morning. And very, very briefly, the background to this is about what happened in rural England between 1985 and 2005, when there was a series of very serious epidemics, pandemics, animal welfare pandemics, BSE, mad cow disease, and foot and mouth, okay? And a series of crises that went through British agriculture, okay? And for Celia and I, working in Manchester in the 80s, we first met in 1987, 88, when I was doing starting to do a PhD research project at what was then Manchester or the Metropolitan University. I was very lucky. I was able to get a fellowship, and they wanted me to look at public art. But I realized very quickly the public art they wanted me to look at was really about prestige urban art projects. And I should explain also that, of course, I'm Irish, and I come from a farm background in Ireland. I grew up in a small farming community in the west of Ireland, went through art school, and then found myself in England in the cities with a doctorate, a PhD, looking at public art in urban areas. And then one day I realized I was doing the wrong thing. And I just say, in this space, before we go to talk about the rural project, I think, and it's just a feeling, one of the problems that we as professionals, I don't know what I mean professionals, is we're trained in universities, we're trained in a very rational way, our expertise, whether it's community development, public arts, even leaders, and I'm speaking personally now, we tend to adopt an attitude that we know, we are the experts, of course, and we believe that we're sensitive to our communities. But very often, what we think we're doing is actually, in a way, disadvantaging, or so it's a crisis of professionalism, how to understand really what's going on within the context in which we live. And often, that understanding comes about through a personal crisis or an intellectual crisis where you question your own motives as a professional. I think it's important to be able to do that. So in a sense, the first mistake I made was assuming I understood this notion of community art and public art and how art could benefit society. So it was important to interrogate that assumption. And this is what happened, okay? Often these things happen by accident, but when you look back, you realize how very obvious it was. I lived in a small village outside Manchester, up in the hills, which was mainly a marginal hill farming community, because England is a very urbanized society. I mean, 89% of the people live in cities, but yet the rural hinterland is 90% of the land. So there's a conflict of culture. And I lived in a small village where there was still a small group of farmers. And this is how the story begins. So it's a small village on the urban fringe of a major city, and the farmers who live on the hills, the hill farmers, of course, every Saturday they come into the village and they come to the pub, and men and women are drinking. You drink with the. I'm just a visiting artist. I happen to live in the village, and I'm listening to the farmers, and they're always complaining, and their complaints are predictable. They don't have enough money. The sheep wool is not enough, their wives don't understand them, the milk is bad, the cow, on and on and on. This went on for almost 10, 15 years, same farmers, same complaints. But one week, something changed. The farmers in the pub were all down the end of the bar, and they were speaking amongst themselves very quietly and with great anxiety. I'm curious, so I say, what's the problem? And they say, we can't tell you. We're not allowed to tell you what's happening. I said, what do you mean? They said, there's something wrong with the cows, they're dying, and the government has told us not to say anything. That was the beginning of mad cow disease, BSE. Okay? The farmers were in conflict because they wanted to tell the public what was happening, and the government was saying, keep it quiet, we'll take the dead cows away, don't tell anybody. But the farmers realized there was a moral and ethical conflict. And they said, Ian, we're not able to tell people what's happening. We have no voice here. This is John Hartley, the farmer, with his children and on his bike. And this is his dog, Fly. Is it Fly? Is the dog called Fly? See here? Yeah. In his farm near Manchester, it's about maybe 40 minutes drive out. It's quite rural. You can see the barn shed, and the title of the project was an art project we devised. It took us about a year to work it out, to help the farmers communicate about what was happening to them. John Hartley is a tenant farmer. You may know in England, we have many small farmers. They tend to be tenants. They rent the farm from the landlord. It's still a very medieval system in some ways. You have the aristocracy and the large landowners. Many of the private companies have bought up land. It's a very unequal and it's a very socially detrimental system. The hill farmers are really an extraordinary group of people who are struggling to survive. So this is about their story as well. At the same time, in the cities, Manchester, Birmingham, London, the government had introduced a new lottery fund for the arts, which was generating, I think, just under €750 million per year, 99% of which was going to the cities. So you have this distortion. Okay? So we went to the Arts Council and we said, we have all this money for the cities. It works out about, I think it's £300 to £400 million per year just for art from the lottery. That's additional money. I don't know with euros, I think you may be 1.5, is it? So it's quite a lot of money. That project had come in 5 years previously. So we went to, this is a meeting that we set up with the farming leaders of the Arts Council policy people in London. It took us 1.5 years to get the meeting set up. The basics of the meeting was, can we have some money from the cultural lottery to help the hill farmers and to work with the farming sector? The response from the Arts Council was, no. We said, why? We said, agriculture is not our responsibility. That's the responsibility of the agriculture ministry. Go to the agriculture ministry and ask them for money. But of course, by this time, working with the hill farmers, we found out about LEADER. I mean, we came to LEADER a little late on the process. We found out about this extraordinary program. So we said, look, there's already a European precedent whereby funding is made available to help rural communities develop a cultural response to their economic and social. So we're able to use the LEADER model as a way to explain to the Arts Council that they should be releasing some of this funding to help the farmers reorganize their economy and society. Okay? So we organized meetings. We had really two jobs to do. One was to mobilize the farming community, the rural community, to demand cultural equity. So it wasn't just access to LEADER money. The rural leaders, the Arts Council said, well, look, we don't hear any voices from the rural. We don't hear any, no farmers come and talk to us. So we said, okay, we'll organize meetings for you and the farmers. And they said, okay. They sort of thought it would be fun, sort of just a token gesture. But the farming and the rural community needed to mobilize also to make a demand for cultural equity. So that's what we organized seminars around England with rural young people, women's groups, and to basically mobilize the rural community to make to insist on cultural equity. Because in a highly urbanized culture like England, although the concept of the rural is a kind of romantic notion, the reality escapes the urban attention. Okay, so using cultural means to open up the rural to the urban policy discourse. Okay, I don't want to bore you with the text, but basically, what we had to do was to persuade the bureaucrats in London who control cultural policy and cultural funding. They said, come back with some arguments that will persuade us to release cultural funding for the rural sector. And the two things they said, you have to make the economic argument. If you want to change policy, like we're not policy experts, but the bureaucrats are saying, okay, basically, intellectually we understand the argument, the rural should have access to this cultural funding, but our system doesn't allow us to give you the money unless you come up with precedents and you can prove that there's an economic argument and a social argument. So we had to learn how to write policy. We employed policy consultants. We talked to the farming leaders and they said, yeah, if we have to have a policy to get money, we'll buy one, we'll buy two, okay? The question began in 1996 with BSE. Why is this happening? Why are the cows dying? Why is the government trying to suppress that information? And why do the farmers and the rural leaders feel culturally marginalized, culturally dispossessed at a time when we had a socialist government that talked about community access and democracy? And then 5-6 years later, we have another agricultural crisis, foot and mouth. A cattle disease, cow disease, sheep disease, which closed Britain, closed the country down for 6 months between March 2001 and June 2001. In that period, the British economy and the government statistic office has calculated that the nation lost about 5 billion euros in lost revenue. Never mind the compensation they had to pay farmers. Hundreds of thousands of animals slaughtered. The north of England was a disaster zone. If you drove on the motorway between Glasgow and Manchester through the north of England, you would see columns of smoke of burning cows and sheep. When you rolled the window down, it smelled like a bad hamburger joint. The burning meat was appalling. I am not exaggerating. So you had this catastrophe, which was, so what is the connection here? The connection here is that industrial agriculture, the intensive farming of animals, which is where we got BSE, the failure of government policy to safeguard public health, and the farmers being victimized. The farmers were blamed for foot and mouth, they were blamed for BSE. You had a system where a government wouldn't take responsibility, the food industry wouldn't take responsibility, the farmers were being forced into intensive agriculture, and they were saying, look, this is ridiculous. We have and one farmer said to me, he was a farmer leader, he said, Ian, we have the wrong agricultural policy. The policy that we have is killing people. It's destroying animals, destroying land. So, I don't mean to over-dramatize it, I'm sure you're familiar with this. As an artist, as a cultural person, from a farming background, who's got a PhD in cultural policy, and I'm asking myself, why are we putting millions into the cities when we've got this national crisis, the agricultural crisis, a crisis of food, a crisis of agriculture, and rural communities struggling to try and reorganize their lives. The level of farm suicides, farmers committing suicide, rocketed up during this period. So the foot and mouth crisis changed everything, and it made the government and the urban people think, wait a minute, we need to look at making a response to this crisis. So this is our story. How we forgive me if it's been a long introduction, but I think it's important. So we began looking at this notion of documenting a cultural crisis. We said by 2001, 2002, what we then were saying to the bureaucrats in London and to the Arts Council, the crisis in agriculture, the crisis in the rural community isn't just economic, it's a crisis of culture, of values. What do we value here? And how do we, so we as artists, of course in the cities, we were renegotiating the city, looking at new economies for the post-industrial cities. So we said we should use the same cultural means to examine this problem in the rural and agricultural sector. And of course, there's an irony here too in that we had artists who were actually doing projects about epidemics. They were working with the veterinary, the government research labs. So this is the foot and mouth virus. This is artists who were doing photographic projects to image the virus. So this little virus, as you see from the created 7 billion pounds of, or 8-9 billion euros. So you were looking at trying to explain to people what was going on. Other artists were looking at biotechnology, of course, the whole impact of animal cloning. It became clear to us by about 2000, 2001, that not only was it about epidemics, that within agriculture and farming were life issues, issues about the generation of new life and the ethical implications of that. At the same time, we began talking, we became very involved in working with farmers' networks. If you like, we left the art world which was part of what I was going to talk about later on, maybe tomorrow, where artists, you really have to leave the art world. You have to depart. What I mean the art world, the professional art world of biennales and exhibitions and galleries and that whole, it's very exciting, it's very powerful, but I think it's irrelevant in some way. But how do you detach the creative inquiry, the capacity for creative thinking, detach it from that very self-focused art world and move it across and then relocate it with a culture that's been ignored except for later. So it's very important. So this is a cultural transfer. So we began having meetings with different farming groups. These are our heroes and heroines. Farming culture, rural culture is extraordinary. It's so important. Okay, next page. Now we talk about some art projects. And it's been a long introduction, but I think it's important to set, as it were, set the parameters. So eventually, and we after Foot and Mouth, the Arts Council contacted us and say, look, we remember your arguments, come back and have a talk with us. We were lucky. The head of policy in the Arts Council was from a rural background. That was just an accident. Had she not been from a rural background, we would never have had the meeting, but it happened. And the basis of the meeting, they said, look, we'll give you some money, £80,000, compared to what they were giving the cities. It was quite not percent, but it worked. And we said we'd like to do a project about the hill farmers, the most vulnerable, marginal hill farmers, who already were part of a major leader project. So the leader methodology became really important in explaining to the Arts Council how they could respond to this. So one of the, maybe Celia should talk about this project. Sorry.
Yes, well, so I've been impressed since coming to Finland late last night. Every minute I've been awake, I've been impressed by hearing of the amount that is being done for refugees from countries from all over, everywhere in Finland. But one of the problems in the British countryside is that whereas our cities are very multicultural, and people have more or less come to terms with that, it will take a few problems still, as people do tend to divide into sectors. But in the countryside, they haven't come upon immigrants, especially not Black African immigrants or even the Asian ones at all. And the children are not learning to integrate in the way that city children do from the age of 4 upwards. Art Barns is what we called it, a project that we started from a very simple idea. We would invite about 12 artists, it ended up slightly more than that, to work, each of them, on a farm with a farmer on a different problem that the farmers were having, and produce at the end of it an artwork, and then there would be an exhibition, a bit like a biennale but spread over a large area, where you went on a sort of an adventure trail and went from farm to farm looking at the projects, and it would give the farmers a chance to speak to people from outside the area about their problems, using the artwork as the impetus for that. Right, we've got the farmers and the barns. The farmers were paid, that was the next thing. The farmers were actually paid to allow the artists to work there. This was quite a new thing, and we had thought it would be difficult to find farmers who would work with artists, because the two sounded like a sort of an oppositional idea. But they discovered that each were as poor as the other, in fact. And the fact that both were getting a little money made all the difference. It was at the heart of what we were trying to do, was to bring different sorts of people. We had an Australian artist, we had a New Zealand sheep, we knew all about sheep farming artist, but one of them was an African woman artist from the centre of Manchester. She was actually a textile artist, Mama Toro there, and she was given the farmers for £500, which is not very much money. It's a bit more than €500, but not much more. We're prepared to actually clean out a barn and make it available to the artists. It's a lot of work. That's a lot of money. And what Toro did with her barn, and I'll just give you this one instance. There were 12 projects, but this one instance, she took the barn and she recreated, using textile designs and textile materials, cowrie shells and cow dung, to transform it into a very beautiful African village. But she called her project A Better Life for Rural Women, because she was a very powerful and politically minded woman. And when she understood the plight that the English farmers were in, she said, that's ridiculous. In our country, they'd all be up storming the cities. What is happening? We need a better life for rural women. She worked with the primary school children. She had them plastering the sides of the barn with a mixture of cow dung and something black. It came out a beautiful black tarry colour. I don't know how we got that past health and safety, but no parents objected. The children really enjoyed it. They made a very beautiful, almost a decor. And then Toro had meetings with the women in the space that she had made, a completely African space in the middle of this tiny little English village in the countryside. And one of the things, of course, we'd said when we were making an argument for this amount of money that they gave us was that the projects would not just end in themselves, but that they would have an afterlife. There would be some reform, something better would come out of them. And this part of the project was nice in that Toro was a very friendly and gregarious person. She made friends with the farming families. She herself organised from Manchester visits of refugee women from Africa, especially Muslims, to come up to the farms and have a farm visit, because most of our immigrant people only see the cities in Britain. They almost never get into the countryside. It's changing slightly, but it was actually almost unheard of.
And they tend to be from rural backgrounds.
Oh yes, and because the refugees are often from farming backgrounds, of course going to a city and in a different country is a double cultural one. So to come to a farm and be able to relate it to their own agricultural experiences was a very fruitful double way that everybody benefited.
As Celia was saying, the basics of the project, after working for almost 2 years to persuade the Arts Council to release a modest amount of lottery money for a farming project, the artists and the farmers worked on different farms over a 3-month period over the summer of 1999. And as Celia was also saying, the agreement with the artists and farmers is the artists could use the barn, but also they had to farm. And it was the conversation between the farmers and the artists that gave rise to the project. And the artists had two choices. They had two options. One was they could make an artwork of their own idea in the barn. They could be artists, just use the barn as a gallery. Or they could talk to the farmers and develop a project that in some way addressed a creative solution to one of the rural problems, economic, social, environmental. That really sat at the heart of the project for us. And this project exemplified it possibly the best. There were problems. I'm not saying all of these projects were successful. It was a learning experience. On the barbecue are African plantain. That's the diet of some of the African communities in Manchester. An English lamb, but slaughtered halal in the Muslim tradition. So you have a meeting of cultures, a group of Somali women. I know you do similar work here, so it's not unfamiliar to you. Children, the farmer. When I began the presentation, you had that photograph of John Hartley on his tractor with his children and his dog. A tenant farmer, virtually unable to maintain the farm because his wife works full-time as a nurse. Most of these hill farmers are marginal. They cannot make a living from the farm. They have to work, but they do not want to give up the farm. They say, the farm is my culture. My animals are my life. Without my animals and my farm, I die. The other problem the farmers had was this problem of how to communicate with the urban society, with the urban opinion formers. We had young artists, African artists, out of Manchester, out of the city, living and working on the farms, who gained an insight into the hill farming culture, which wasn't all negative. A lot of it is very positive. These young designers and artists and filmmakers did two things. They sort of realized here was another aspect of English culture that is equally important to the urban culture. We weren't lecturing them or forcing them or saying, they just discovered it through the right. The farmers also realized that they had a cultural voice, that what they had to say about their animals, about their countryside, about the food that they produced, they of course are full of pride. But they realized through art and through, one of the projects was a radio station. We did marketing projects. We had young designers designing club fashion gear for young farmers to go clubbing in the clubs in Manchester. So we're looking at a two-way cultural interface. Remember what the government said. It said, we'll give you this money if you can come back to us and prove to us that the cultural money you're using with the farmers also has an economic outcome. There's John Hartley with his milk, delivering his milk from his farm into the African community in Manchester. Why? When the African people, Somali, came to visit the farm, they drank the milk, John's milk, straight from the dairy and said, this tastes much better than the milk we get from Tesco. Can we buy your milk? So here's John delivering his milk direct to his customers because of a mutual cultural understanding. Thank you. And one of the images on the presentation that we didn't have time to talk about, we had an African woman and we had an English farm woman in the kitchen with tea. And you know the rest of the story. It was between the women, the African women and the English farming woman, not the man, where an understanding was arrived at. We couldn't have planned it, artists couldn't have planned it, and it was a cultural understanding that bridged continents, bridged cultures, and arrived at a very quick understanding that women solve problems in a different way. And that's not to be patronizing. And of course we had organized the project partly on the idea that the artists would bring part of the solution into this problem, in the sense we were already defining the farmers as a problem, which is a mistake. But it's the accidental, the unexpected, where the cultural solutions mostly arrive. And that conversation between the African woman, Toro, and the farming wife, Sarah, was in the context of children, the domestic kitchen, and sharing food. They told me to go away. Go away. And of course, out of that conversation came, Sarah spoke to Toro, they shared, and of course, there's a rural, part of the commonality was they're both from rural backgrounds, they're both rural women, they both earn their livelihood from working with animals. There was that immediate empathy, which just transformed everything. And out of that came the economic project, which was marketing how Sarah's husband, John, he's the farmer, he's the leader, he's the breadwinner, so to speak. He then, not because his wife tells him, but because there's a sense of a solution, Ben realizes that he can sell his meat from his sheep and his milk, which he was having problem, into the African community in Manchester. A marketing project came out of that, because in a sense, what I'm here to talk about is also the role of artists, that of course, what artists are really good at is creating situations where wonderful accidents gather. Be professional, but look after your accidents. Okay? Because it's the unexpected, the accidental, we can be, are really, which makes cultural change. Not museums, not art galleries, not European cultural funding, insights across culture. And just to finish off with one other example, because it's you can see where I hope my proposition is, that the other slide, the other image, was a farm woman, her name is Sally Robinson, holding up I don't know how you say it in Finnish, brassiere, the ladies' undergarment, what do you call it?
Rintaliivit.
She was holding it up? Did you also notice that Sally was a woman in English again of ample proportions? Can you translate?
Muodokas nainen oli tämä.
That's a very important project because and Celia loves this one, it's the other proposition is, and it's one of the things that we set out as a small art group to say is art without artists. Translate that.
Just
Art without artists. We don't need artists.
Taidetta ilman taiteilijoita.
And here's just, I'll finish off with explain that project. Sally Robinson was the wife of a farmer, a hill farmer. She lives in Yorkshire, and her story is amazing. She, like many farming wives of the marginal farmers, are really the breadwinners. They're the ones that actually bring in, they work as designers or they're the one that keep the farm going. Sally, we've invited her to a number of our conferences, and she said, I said, how did it begin, Sally? She said, well, I listened to my husband complaining about the fact that he couldn't earn a living from the farm and he couldn't get enough money from the sheep. And she said, he complained on and on, and I said to him, why don't you stop? And he says, I can't, I love my job. So she said, I got really fed up with this, she said, and I realized we had to get some money to keep because the men are not going to change, she said. They're so stupid, they will never change, right? So she said, I said to myself one day, what can I do to earn some money? This is a Leader Plus program. And she said, I had assets. And she said, this is how she speaks, right? She said, I realized I had difficulty finding underwear, a brassiere, to fit because I'm a woman of ample, in English we say ample, large proportion, okay? But there was nowhere I could order lingerie or underwear to fit myself. So I decided to set up my own company. She said, I called it the Ample Bosom Marketing Company. The concept was very simple because that's when the internet was coming in, online marketing. She set up a catalog sale company to sell lingerie to women of ample proportions. She started off very small, but it got bigger. She said, I worked out how to get this distributors. I worked out I had to learn how to set up a catalog. I had to learn how to market. She said, I just did it. And she's now employing 15 women. And instead of having sheep in the barn, she has women packing lingerie. They've made a film about Sally. They've done a drama, a film about how she set the company up. She's employing local women, and it's a runaway success. And I spoke to her a couple of years ago. I said, how's it going, Sally? She said, it's going great, but my husband is still complaining about not earning a living from sheep. The point I'm making here is creativity. We can have art without artists. So the creativity of women and men on the farm, it's not just artists. Those creative solutions to cultural and social never overlook the fact it's endogenous creativity. Yeah.
We also know an American artist who was not an artist, Patrick Doherty. What was his job?
Yes, he was a health technician.
A health technician. He had at least one child, a handicapped child, and problems with his wife. And he was sitting there, he thought he had to give up his job to look after the family, basically. And he thought, what can I do just sitting here? What do I know about? He was a man not even particularly educated. And he looked around his yard and he said, gee, I guess I know a lot about brushwood, because he'd spent his life sweeping it out of the way, and he'd noticed the way it tangles up. And he became a sculptor working with brushwood, making the most wonderful, enormous sculptures. He's now very famous. And it's just looking at yourself and thinking, what do I know about?
My proposition is this, and it's a controversial one. Do we really need artists? I mean, of course we do. No.
Stop it. You start losing your
of course we need artists and architects, of course. I mean, I'm not. But is it really, particularly maybe in Finland, particularly in rural and even in urban areas, is it really about to unlock the creativity, the capacity that people have, not to make great art, but to change lives? And I think I would argue